Rhyme and meter in poetry. In this lecture, we're going to explore how to understand the style in which poems are written. Although when you analyze poetry, you look at it at three levels: the content, the style, and the theme. They cannot be separated. And understanding the content and the theme comes about oftentimes through understanding the style. When poets write, they can choose to write a free verse poem which has no regular rhyme scheme or meter. This gives them a lot of freedom in terms of how to express their emotions. Much of the contemporary poetry that we have is written in free verse form. There may be rhythm to it, but it's not consistent. Traditional poetry especially is written as structured verse, which is when there's a deliberate pattern of rhyme and meter used in the poetry. This can show a lot of control and skill, and although not many contemporary poets use this, it's important to understand how we can analyze poetry that's structured, and that's what this lecture is about. When we speak, we always put a natural emphasis on the words. If you ran across an unfamiliar word, you might look it up in the dictionary to see a phonetic respelling. In that respelling, you'd see bold print or accent marks showing you which syllables the emphasis was on. When we speak, though, we often put stress or emphasis on words of one syllable even to show our meaning. Here's an experiment. If I say, "I never said that," the emphasis is on who the speaker is, how the message is being distributed. But if I change that, keeping the words exactly the same, just change the stress. "I never said that." Now the implication is maybe that I implied some meaning or I suggested some meaning. The whole connotation of that sentence changes because of the word I've chosen to emphasize. In poetry, as in regular speech, words have a natural pronunciation. For example, the word listen has two syllables with the stress going on the first syllable. But the word look, which is one syllable, could be stressed or unstressed. It depends on if that word is important enough to the poet to get meaning, to get stress. Poets will arrange words in a line of poetry so that they fall where the rhythm of the stress falls. There are names for those kinds of rhythm. We call meter measuring the rhythm of a poem. We mark it by using this symbol, a slash mark for a stressed syllable or a U for an unstressed syllable, and we call these patterns feet. There are 5 metrical feet that you'll explore in this unit. The first and most popular is called the I am, and that's when you have an unstressed and a stressed syllable pattern repeating in lines. Please note too that if you find a pattern in one line of poetry, you're likely to have that same pattern throughout the whole poem. A trochee is when you have a stressed and then an unstressed syllable. A dactyl is a stressed followed by 2 unstressed syllables. Notice it's a 3-syllable metrical foot as opposed to these 2-syllable feet. An anapest has 2 unstressed syllables and then a stressed syllable. And a spondee has 2 stressed syllables back to back. Notice this is not really used in poetry as a pattern, so I'm putting this in here just for informational purposes. You might see it as part of a line. For example, Romeo and Juliet, when they say strike drum, they're just using those 2 words with emphasis, but the rest of the line follows a different pattern. To determine the meter, you can start by reading the line and thinking about the words that carry the most meaning. For example, in the poem Love Is Not All by Edna St. Vincent Millay, when she writes, "And rise and sink again," you can tell that rise and sink are more important to her than the word and. And so you can begin by marking the stress and unstressed by thinking about words such as that. You'll begin to notice a pattern. But when we're looking for a pattern, we want to talk about how many times it occurs in a line of poetry. So for example, if I have an unstressed and then a stressed pattern repeating 5 times in one line of poetry, what is that called? Well, you look at it like this. An I am occurring 5 times, we'll refer to it with using the Greek root penta and call it iambic pentameter. You do that with every sort of meter adding on how many times you see it. Typically, you don't see mono or dimeters, but tri with three patterns repeating, tetra with 4 patterns repeating, penta is 5, hexa is 6, hepta is 7, octa is 8. For example, if you had 8 anapests in a line, you could call it anapestic octameter. If you had anapestic tetrameter, how many syllables would be in that line? Well, an anapest, remember, is made up of 3 syllables. And if it occurs 4 times, that line of poetry would have 12 syllables. It's understanding not just how poetry is written, but thinking about writing your own poetry, you want to remember that rhyme, scheme, and meter are tied together. So when you have a structured poem, it could be written in blank verse, which is unrhymed iambic pentameter. But usually there's a rhyme scheme that matches the rhythm, and often rhyming lines will share the same meter. When we mark rhyme, then this is a review, we'll use letters at the end of the line because rhyme is based on the last vowel sound in the syllable. And we mark it with the letter of the alphabet. Here's an example. And here on this turning of the stair, we use an A because our last syllable, stair, is the first word. Between passion and doubt, we designate this with a B because doubt and stare don't rhyme. I pause and say a double prayer. Notice I use an A again because of the rhyme. One for you and one for you. C, because it doesn't rhyme with either of the words we've seen so far, and so they cancel out. B, again, designates the rhyme that we see here. There are many different types of rhyme, though. Sight rhyme, for example, are words that look like on the surface that they rhyme, although in reality we don't pronounce them the same way. This could be something like rain and again, which when we look at them they have the same spelling, or love and prove. And typically with structured poems, if we see a pattern and this is also part of that pattern, we give the author some leniency when analyzing the work. That can be useful if you're trying to write a structured poem and you have just almost the exact pattern developed that you need. You're allowed to use sight rhymes, or eye rhymes they're sometimes called. Internal rhyme occurs when you have a rhyme in the middle of the line and at the end of the line of poetry, such as in Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary, well I pondered, weak and weary. And you see dreary here occurring in the middle, rhyming with the end. We call that internal rhyme. Feminine rhyme involves when you have one or more unstressed syllables at the end of a line of poetry rhyming, like dicing and enticing. Although technically we said rhyme is the last vowel sound, this occurs with more than one. Identical rhyme is when the exact words are used over again. End rhymes are the most common way of thinking about it, where we look for the last vowel sound in each word, each line of poetry. And masculine rhymes, very common when you have just the last syllable. These two work together. They're not mutually exclusive. So think about if the poem ends with well and bell. That would be an example of both end and masculine rhyme. There are patterns we'll talk about with structured poetry and rhyme. A couplet is when you have 2 consecutive rhyming lines, such as AA or BB. A quatrain is 4 lines set together when the second, at least the second and the fourth line rhyme. That can be designated AB, AB, or AB, CB. A sestet would be 6 lines together in either patterns of 2 or 3 rhymes. For example, you could have CD, 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 or you may have CDE, CDE. It wouldn't be any more than 3 rhymes in a sestet. An octave just involves the 2 rhymes, and it's usually written ABBA, ABBA. One of the most famous types of structured poetry is called a sonnet. A sonnet is always 14 lines written in iambic pentameter, but the rhyme scheme can vary. The 2 most popular types of rhyme scheme are Shakespearean sonnets or English sonnets, and they involve having 3 quatrains and a couplet. Or Petrarchan, he was an Italian. He used an octave and sestet, and that formula kind of withstood the test of time. The thing to remember about sonnets is it's not so much the structure, although that's very tightly controlled, it's that they're complex in their dilemma. Generally, sonnets present either a conflict or a problem, some complexity of life, and then by the end of the twist, you'll see a change in perspective. With a Petrarchan sonnet, that's going to be a more subtle change as these lines are almost balanced. But with a Shakespearean sonnet, you can always look at the couplet as you're trying to understand the theme. And that's how understanding the structure can help us understand why the poet was writing. And that's rhyme and meter and poetry.